For 3 years, Frank Donovan, a quiet man with weathered hands, visited McBride's diner daily, sitting at booth 7 ordering coffee, oatmeal, and eggs. Helen McBride, the diner's heart, served him with kindness, never prying into his silence. His routine, $10 tucked under the plate, became a comforting constant. But one stormy February, Frank braved the snow, and Helen gifted him pie. He left $50, a rare gesture. Then, he stopped coming. Helen, haunted by his absence, kept his coffee ready, sensing a deeper story behind the empty booth, unaware of the profound legacy he'd soon reveal. If this story touched you, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more tales of quiet heroes. Comment below about a kind act or someone like Frank who impacted you. Your support helps us honor these stories. Join us to keep their legacies alive. Thank you. Every morning, just as the first hints of dawn crept over the Wyoming horizon, Frank Donovan would step through the frosted glass door of McBride's diner, his silhouette framed briefly against the pale, cold light. For 3 years, he arrived like clockwork, always choosing the solitude of booth 7, tucked in the far corner where the hum of the world felt softer. His hands, rough and weathered like old leather, betrayed a life of labor, though he never spoke of it. His eyes, a muted gray, carried a quiet weight, as if they'd seen too much but refused to let it show. He ordered the same thing every day: a cup of black coffee, a bowl of oatmeal with a pat of butter, and 2 eggs, sunny side up. His words were few, his voice low and gravelly, as if each syllable cost him something. When he finished, he'd leave a crisp $10 bill, always folded into a perfect square, tucked neatly under his plate like a secret meant only for the one who cleared it. Helen McBride, the diner's heart and soul, was the only one who never hurried him, never pressed him for conversation, never treated him as just another face in the morning crowd. She saw the man behind the routine, the one others overlooked, and in her quiet way, she honored his presence. Then came a morning in late January, when the air was sharp with frost and the sky hung heavy with the promise of more snow. The door swung open, but it wasn't Frank who crossed the threshold. Instead, 6 Marines in crisp dress blues stepped inside, their polished shoes clicking softly on the worn linoleum. One carried a wooden box, small and solemn, cradling a folded American flag. The sight stopped Helen's breath, her hands trembling as she set down a coffee pot. In that moment, she understood that the quiet man at booth 7 had left her something far greater than she could have ever imagined, a legacy that would linger in her heart long after the frost melted from the windows. Helen McBride was the kind of woman who carried the weight of the world with a steady grace. In her late 60s, her once dark hair was now streaked with silver, each strand a testament to decades spent on her feet, serving plates and pouring coffee. Her back had a slight curve now, the kind that comes from years of bending over counters and carrying trays. But her eyes still sparkled with a warmth that could thaw even the coldest Wyoming morning. Her voice, soft and steady, had a way of making people feel seen, like they mattered in a world that often forgot them. Every day, just after 5 a.m., she'd unlock the diner's doors, flip on the flickering fluorescent lights, and set about the quiet rituals that had defined her life for over 30 years. McBride's diner was her sanctuary, a place she and her late husband, Carl, had built from nothing but a bank loan, a second-hand coffee machine, and a shared dream of creating a haven for their small town. Carl had been a firefighter, the kind of man who ran toward danger while others fled. He was dependable, always the first to arrive at a call and the last to leave, his broad shoulders carrying the weight of his crew's trust. 5 years ago, he'd collapsed while mowing their lawn, a sudden heart attack stealing him away before Helen could even say goodbye. The grief was a heavy stone in her chest, one she carried silently, afraid that speaking it aloud might make it too real. Left behind was their teenage grandson, Tyler, the son of Helen's only daughter, who had spiraled into a life of addiction and trouble, leaving Tyler in Helen's care since he was 8. Now 17, Tyler was a lanky boy with his grandfather's kind eyes but a restless spirit, searching for his place in a world that seemed to move too fast for a kid raised in the slow rhythm of a diner. Helen loved him fiercely, though she worried about the uncertainty in his gaze, the way he seemed caught between the boy he'd been and the man he wasn't ready to become. McBride's diner wasn't much to look at anymore. The teal booths were faded, Their vinyl cracked in places, and the linoleum floors creaked underfoot, worn smooth by decades of footsteps. But to the early risers of the town, truck drivers hauling freight, mail carriers sorting rotes, teachers grading papers over coffee, and widowers seeking solace in routine, it was a refuge. They didn't come just for the food, which was simple and hearty, but for Helen's presence. She had a gift for noticing the small things. A regular who skipped their usual bacon, a missing wedding ring, a smile that didn't quite reach the eyes. She remembered birthdays, slipping an extra slice of pie onto a plate with a quiet, "Happy day, hun." She listened when someone needed to talk, her hands busy wiping counters or refilling mugs, her heart open to their stories. The diner was full of her quiet acts of grace, folded napkins stacked neatly by the register, a bulletin board pinned with faded photos of customers' kids and grandkids, the soft hum of the radio filling the early morning silence. It wasn't a glamorous life, but it was hers, rich with purpose and small, sacred moments. And then there was Frank Donovan, the constant at booth 7. It was a Tuesday in late January 3 years ago when he first appeared, the wind howling outside with a ferocity only a Wyoming winter could muster. Snow blanketed the streets, muffling the world in a hush that made the diner feel like the only warm place left. Helen was refilling sugar caddies, her hands moving with the practiced ease of routine, when she looked up and saw him. Tall and lean, his shoulders still held the squared posture of a younger man, though a limp favored his right leg, a silent story of pain he never shared. He moved with purpose but no hurry, settling into booth 7 as if it had been waiting for him. His face was lined, his hair thin and gray, but there was a dignity in his bearing, a quiet strength that made Helen pause. He didn't speak beyond his order, and she didn't push him. She sensed he carried something heavy, something he wasn't ready to lay down, and she respected that silence, serving him with the same care she gave everyone, but with an extra gentleness, as if she knew he needed it. Over the years, Frank became part of the diner's rhythm, as steady as the sunrise. Helen would watch him from behind the counter, wondering about the life he'd lived, the stories behind those weathered hands and quiet eyes. She imagined him as a man who'd seen war, perhaps, or loss, or both, someone who'd learned to keep his heart guarded, but couldn't hide the kindness in his folded $10 bills. She felt a kinship with him, two souls who understood the weight of time, who found comfort in the small, predictable routines of a diner at dawn. When the Marines walked in that January morning, their faces solemn and their steps measured, Helen's heart sank. She knew without them saying a word that Frank was gone. The flag in the wooden box was a silent testament to a life she'd only glimpsed, but one that had touched hers in ways she was only beginning to understand. As she stood there, the coffee pot still warm in her hand, she felt the weight of his absence, but also the gift of his presence, a reminder that even the quietest lives could leave echoes that lingered long after they were gone. Each morning, with a steady cadence of a man who carried his purpose close to his chest, Frank Donovan stepped into McBride's diner. His walk was unhurried, deliberate, as if every step was a choice, a quiet declaration of his place in the world. The diner, with its chipped formica counters and the faint scent of grease and coffee, seemed to exhale in relief at his arrival, as if it too had been waiting for him. Helen, the waitress who had poured more cups of coffee than she could count, greeted him with a smile that felt like home. "What'll it be today, Mr. Donovan?" she asked, her voice warm, threaded with the kind of care that came from years of seeing people at their most human. Frank's eyes, a pale, piercing blue, met hers. They held a depth she couldn't quite read, something between resolve and resignation, like a man who had seen too much but refused to look away. With a single nod, he spoke, his voice low and rough, like gravel underfoot. "Oatmeal, 2 eggs, black coffee." Those words, sparse and unchanging, were the cornerstone of their daily ritual. At precisely 6:30 a.m., Frank appeared as reliable as the dawn. No storm could keep him away, not snow that piled high against the diner's windows, not rain that turned the streets to rivers, not wind that howled like a living thing. Booth 7, with its view of the quiet street and its worn vinyl seat, was his. He ordered the same meal, ate with a slow, almost meditative focus, and left $10 on the table. $8.50 for the food, $1.50 extra, folded with precision and tucked beneath his plate like a note meant only for Helen's eyes. Frank didn't linger. He didn't chat about the weather or ask about Helen's day. His interactions were limited to two nods, one when she brought his food, another when he stood to leave. Yet in his silence, Helen found a kind of peace. The world outside was loud, unpredictable, full of changes she couldn't control. But Frank Donovan was a constant, a rock in the stream of her long days. She'd lost her husband years ago, and the ache of that loss lingered, woven into the fabric of her life. Raising Tyler, her grandson, alone had brought its own challenges. Worries about money, about keeping him safe, about whether she was enough. In Frank's quiet presence, she found a small reprieve, a moment each morning where the world felt steady. The other waitresses saw him differently. Julie, barely 20 and full of restless energy, would huddle with her co-workers during slow shifts, her voice hushed with unease. "He gives me the creeps, you know? Just sits there, staring, never says a word. Probably lives alone in some creepy cabin or something." Another waitress, newer and eager to fit in, nodded. "Bet he's ex-military, or maybe just off. You ever see how he watches everything?" Their words were sharp, tinged with the thrill of speculation, but Helen stayed quiet. She didn't need to know Frank's story to respect his space. Gossip felt like a betrayal of the unspoken trust they'd built, nod by nod, morning by morning. Instead, she offered her own quiet ritual. "Glad you're here, Mr. Donovan," she'd say as she poured his coffee. He never answered, but sometimes, just sometimes, his nod seemed to hold a little more weight, and that was enough for her. As the years passed, Frank became a part of the diner's soul, as essential as the clock that ticked above the kitchen door or the jukebox that hummed softly in the corner. Helen began to notice the small details that made him real, human. His boots, for example, were always the same, well-worn, the leather creased with the weight of countless steps, but polished just enough to show care without pride. They spoke of a man who valued function over flash, who had walked roads others might never dare to tread. His hands, too, carried stories. Large, weathered, with knuckles that bore the faint swell of age and work. The calluses on his fingertips told of labor, perhaps swinging a hammer or cradling a rifle, or both. Helen wondered about those hands, about the lives they'd shaped, but she never asked. Some questions, she knew, were better left unanswered. Most intriguing was the journal, a small, brown, leather-bound book. It lived in the inner pocket of Frank's coat, always close, like a piece of his heart. He never opened it at the table, never scribbled in it while he ate, but its presence was a quiet constant. Once, when the diner was nearly empty and Helen was wiping down the counter, she saw him pull it out. He thought no one was watching, his movements slow, almost reverent. He flipped through a few pages, his eyes tracing the words with a tenderness that caught Helen off guard. Then, as quickly as he'd opened it, he tucked it away, his face unreadable once more. Helen turned away, her heart heavy with the weight of whatever memories those pages held. She didn't need to know their contents to understand their importance. Tyler, Helen's grandson, was the only one who dared to challenge Frank's silence. At 16, he was all curiosity and courage, working weekend shifts to save for gas money. With his lanky frame and quick grin, he brought a spark to the diner, a reminder of the boy Helen had raised through sleepless nights and quiet fears. One Saturday morning, after setting Frank's plate down, Tyler lingered, his hands in his pockets, his eyes bright with mischief. "You ever get tired of oatmeal, Mr. Donovan?" He asked, his tone light but probing. Helen nearby froze, her rag paused on the counter. Frank stopped, his spoon halfway to his mouth, and looked at Tyler with those pale, unyielding eyes. For a moment, the air felt thick, charged. Then, almost imperceptibly, the corners of Frank's mouth twitched. A hint of a smile, gone as quickly as it came. He nodded once, then returned to his meal. Tyler, grinning like he'd won a prize, sauntered back to the kitchen, already plotting his next move in the game of unraveling Frank Donovan. The fluorescent lights of McBride's diner buzzed softly, casting a warm glow over the linoleum floor as Tyler leaned against the counter, his teenage frame all angles and restless energy. His eyes caught on the faded military patch sewn onto Frank Donovan's jacket. its threads worn but proud, a relic of a life Tyler could only imagine. Curiosity flared in his chest, bright and eager, pushing past the shyness that sometimes tripped his words. "You serve, sir?" he asked, his voice warm, brimming with respect and a hunger for connection. Frank, mid-sip of his coffee, paused, the mug hovering near his lips. His face, carved with lines of hardship and time, turned slowly toward the boy. His gray eyes, sharp yet guarded, met Tyler's, holding a weight that made the air feel thicker. A single nod, deliberate, unyielding, was all he offered. "No more, no less," he said, his voice a low rumble, like distant thunder. Tyler waited, his sneakers scuffing the floor, yearning for a story, a glimpse into the man behind the patch. But Frank's gaze returned to his coffee, his silence a wall Tyler couldn't scale. With a respectful nod, Tyler retreated, disappointment tugging at his heart, the moment fading into the diner's morning hum. Helen, behind the counter, watched it all, her hands busy with a glass but her heart tuned to the quiet exchange. Her graying hair was neat, her apron a canvas of coffee stains and flour dust, but her eyes held a knowing softness. A faint smile touched her lips, not mocking but tender, born of years spent reading people. Frank's silence was his sanctuary, she thought, a place where he could breathe without the weight of his past. She felt a quiet admiration for his restraint, his steady presence like a tree that stood firm through countless storms. As she poured coffee for another regular, her mind lingered on Frank, wondering what ghosts he carried, what joys or sorrows he kept locked away. Then came the storm, a February morning so fierce it seemed the world itself had turned against warmth. Frost clung to the air, turning breath to fleeting clouds, and the roads were glazed with ice, treacherous and cold. Schools closed, and McBride stood nearly empty, its neon sign a faint beacon in the gray dawn. Only Helen, whose life was woven into the diner's rhythm, and Frank Donovan braved the cold. At 6:30, the bell jingled, and Frank stepped inside, snow dusting his shoulders, his coat zipped tight. His boots crunched over the wet floor, leaving trails of melting slush. His nod to Helen was as steady as ever, and he settled into booth 7, his quiet claim to a corner of the world. Helen's heart warmed at his presence, a small anchor in the storm's chaos. She didn't charge him that day. It felt wrong to ask for money when the world was so harsh. She brought as usual, eggs, toast, coffee, and on impulse added a slice of apple pie, its warmth curling through the air. "On the house, Mr. Donovan," she said, her voice soft but rich with gratitude. Frank's eyes met hers, lingering longer than usual, and Helen saw a flicker, surprise perhaps, or a crack in his guarded walls. He nodded wordless and ate, each bite deliberate. Helen watched from the counter, her thoughts swirling. What did that look mean? What did it cost him to accept her kindness? When he left, Helen cleared booth 7, her fingers pausing as she lifted the napkin. Instead of the usual $10, she found a $50, folded with precision, tucked beneath the plate. Her breath caught and a warmth spread through her chest. It was more than money, it was Frank's way of saying thank you, a gesture that spoke volumes in his silence. She held the bill, her thumb tracing its edge, and felt a quiet connection to the man who gave so much with so little. Friday dawned soft, the sky painted in purples and grays. Helen moved through her morning prep, humming Patsy Cline, her heart light with routine. At 6:25, she glanced at booth 7 empty, but she wasn't worried yet. Frank was precise, but even clocks could falter. By 6:30, the booth stayed empty. She brewed fresh coffee, telling herself he'd come. By 6:45, worry knotted her stomach, and she peered through the frosted windows, searching for his silhouette. The sidewalk remained bare. The morning brought familiar faces, Marty, Ron, construction workers, but no Frank. At 7 o'clock, Helen set a cup of coffee at booth 7, a quiet act of hope. Saturday passed, then Sunday, and the absence grew heavier, a weight on her heart. On Monday, Tyler found Helen staring at booth 7, her eyes distant, her face etched with worry. "Everything okay, Gran?" he asked, his voice gentle. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Fine, sweetheart," she said, but her voice betrayed her. It wasn't tiredness, it was loss, a quiet ache for the man who'd become part of her world. A week later, on Tuesday, Helen approached booth 7 with a cloth, her steps heavy. She cleared the untouched place setting, wiping the table with slow, reverent care. She didn't speak, didn't announce it. The act was hers alone, a silent goodbye to a story left unfinished, its echo lingering in her heart. The morning sun spilled through the diner's windows, casting long, golden streaks across the checkered floor. Helen McBride arrived at McBride's diner before the world stirred, her keys jingling softly as she unlocked the door. The quiet was her sanctuary, a moment to breathe before the day began. She moved with the ease of routine, flipping on lights, starting the coffee maker, and humming a tune that felt like an old friend. The aroma of fresh coffee curled through the air, warm and familiar, wrapping her in memories of years spent in this very spot. But today, like every day since that unspoken shift, her eyes drifted to booth 7. She set a single place there, not out of habit, but out of a fragile, persistent hope. A hope that maybe, just maybe, Frank Donovan would walk through that door again, shake off the morning chill, and settle into his usual seat with that quiet nod of his, as if the world hadn't tilted off its axis. Memorial Day morning greeted the small town with a sky so clear it seemed polished, the air carrying the faint scent of cut grass and sun-warmed asphalt. Helen knew the town would be slow today. Most folks were likely at parades or lingering in bed, savoring the holiday. Still, she prepared the diner as if it might fill to the brim, her hands steady, but her heart heavy with a longing she couldn't quite name. Booth 7 sat empty, its red vinyl seat gleaming under the morning light, a silent testament to the man who used to occupy it. Frank, with his weathered hands and kind eyes, had been more than a regular. He'd been a fixture, a quiet presence who saw her, not just the diner owner, but Helen, the woman who carried her own unspoken grief. At precisely 8 a.m., the bell above the door chimed, and the diner fell into an unnatural hush. 6 men stepped inside, their marine dress blues crisp and commanding, buttons gleaming like tiny mirrors, shoes polished to a reflective sheen. The sight was jarring in a town where the most notable visitors were delivery drivers or the occasional lost tourist. Conversations died mid-sentence. Forks paused in the air. Coffee cups hovered, forgotten, halfway to lips. The youngest Marine, barely older than Helen's memories of her nephew Tyler, carried a nervous energy, his eyes wide with the weight of the moment. The oldest, a square-jawed man with silver threading his temples, moved with a steady, unshakable confidence, his presence anchoring the group. Helen stood behind the counter, her heart lurching in her chest. The air felt too thick, her breath catching as she met the gaze of the man in front. He stepped forward, his posture respectful but resolute. "Ma'am, are you Helen McBride?" His voice was firm yet gentle, carrying the weight of something far greater than a simple question. She nodded, her throat tight. "Yes, I am." "I'm Captain Daniel Hale," he said, his tone softening as if he understood the impact of his next words. "We're here on behalf of Frank Donovan." The name struck her like a physical blow, stealing the air from her lungs. Frank, the man who'd sat in booth 7 every morning, sipping black coffee, his smile quiet but warm. The man who'd listened when she spoke, who'd remembered her stories, who'd made her feel seen in a way she hadn't realized she'd needed. Captain Hale reached into a leather case, his movements deliberate, and produced 3 items: a tightly folded American flag, a polished wooden box no larger than a Bible, and a sealed envelope with her name scrawled in bold, slanted cursive. Helen's hands shook as she reached for the flag, clutching it to her chest as if it were a lifeline. The fabric was heavy, sacred, its stars and stripes a silent promise of honor and loss. Her vision blurred, a single tear slipping down her cheek to darken the edge of the envelope. The diner remained still, the silence so thick it felt like the world was holding its breath. The Marines stood at attention, their presence a quiet sentinel, guarding not just Frank's memory, but the weight of everything he'd carried. Captain Hale's voice softened further, his eyes meeting hers with a kindness that felt personal. "He left instructions, ma'am, specific ones. He had no immediate family. He said you were the only person who saw him." The words pierced her, unraveling a flood of emotions she'd kept tightly bound. Frank had seen her too, hadn't he? In the quiet mornings, in the shared silences, in the way he'd linger over his coffee as if the diner were more than a stop. It was a home. Helen's voice broke as she whispered, "I need a moment." Clutching the flag and envelope, she slipped through the swinging door to the back room, leaving the diner frozen in its reverence. In the cramped office that had once been her husband's, Helen sank into the worn chair at the old desk. The flag rested in her lap, its weight grounding her as her trembling fingers broke the envelope's seal. The paper inside was thick, cream-colored, chosen with care, as if Frank had known this moment would matter. His handwriting was clean, deliberate, each stroke a testament to the man who'd written it. "Dear Helen," the letter began, "if you're reading this, it means I've gone to meet my wife again." Her hand flew to her mouth, stifling a sob. Tears blurred the ink, but she didn't need to see the words to know what they held. Frank hadn't just left her a letter. He'd left her his heart, his truth, his everything. The words carried the weight of a life lived with quiet courage, of a man who'd found solace in her diner, in her kindness, in the simple act of being seen. As she read, Helen's chest ached with the realization that Booth 7 would never be the same. Not because Frank was gone, but because he'd left behind a piece of himself that would linger in her heart forever. The ink flowed with a measured, deliberate grace, though every so often, a faint tremor revealed the weathered hand of an aging man who still clung to the discipline of precision. Each stroke of the pen carried the weight of a life lived with purpose, etched by a soul who had seen too much yet still found meaning in the small, quiet moments. Dear Helen, if these words have found their way to you, it means I've crossed over to be with my beloved Claire once more. My name is Francis Daniel Donovan, though you, with your warm familiarity, always called me Mr. Donovan, and I cherish that formality. It grounded me, reminded me of a time when respect was a currency I understood. For 29 years, I served as a Marine Recon commander, leading brave men through the shadowed corners of the world, places too grim to recount, memories I've fought to bury deep within me. The medals, citations, and promotions I earned now sit untouched in a dusty drawer, relics of a life that feels like it belonged to someone else. They were honors, yes, but they never filled the hollow spaces left behind. 15 years ago, cancer stole Claire from me. Her absence carved a void so profound, it silenced the world around me. We had no children, though we tried for years, our hopes fading with each passing season. When she left, the vibrancy of life dimmed, and I retreated into myself, a quiet man in a world that no longer seemed to notice me. I wasn't lonely for idle chatter or crowded rooms. What I craved was something simpler, something rarer, acknowledgement. Not the loud applause of a parade or the weight of a medal pinned to my chest, but the quiet dignity of being seen as a person, not a ghost of who I once was. That's what you gave me, Helen. Every morning you greeted me with a smile that felt like sunlight breaking through a storm. You never pried about the limp I carried, a souvenir from battles long past. You never pushed me to share the stories I kept locked away. Instead, you poured my coffee with care, set my plate of eggs down with a gentle hand, and said, "Glad you're here, Mr. Donovan." Those words, simple as they were, stitched together the frayed edges of my heart. In your diner, I wasn't just an old man taking up space in the corner booth. I was someone who mattered, someone whose presence was valued. You gave me dignity, Helen, and that's a gift no ribbon or ceremony could ever match. I watched you, not in a way that intruded, but with the quiet observance of a man who's learned to notice the details that others overlook. You didn't just work. You served with a grace that reminded me of the finest soldiers I ever led. I saw the way you balanced a tray of steaming coffee while helping a young mother settle her fussy baby, your patience never wavering. I saw you repeat orders with kindness to the elderly man whose memory was starting to slip, never once letting frustration creep into your voice. And I saw you slide a slice of pie to a stranger who looked like he was carrying the weight of the world. No questions asked, no expectation of thanks. You didn't do these things for praise or recognition. You didn't share them with the world to prove your goodness. You did them because that's who you are, a beacon of compassion in a world that often forgets what that word means. To me, a man the world had largely forgotten, your quiet acts of kindness were a lifeline. They reminded me that there was still good in the world, still people who cared without needing a reason. Your presence in that diner gave me a place to belong, a sanctuary where I could sit with my thoughts and feel for a moment that I wasn't invisible. So I've left you a few things, tokens of my gratitude for the peace you brought me. Inside the wooden box, you'll find my service journal, the real one, not the sanitized version tucked away in some government archive. Its pages hold the unfiltered truth of my years in the field, the triumphs and the scars. There's also a purple heart, earned after an ambush in Kandahar that left me wounded but allowed 5 of my men to walk away alive. That's the part I carry with pride, not the medal itself, but the lives it represents. You'll find a bronze star too, a testament to moments I rarely speak of. And there's a small photograph, one my old comrade snapped from across the diner. It shows you pouring coffee at booth 7, your smile as warm as ever. He took it because I spoke of you often, Helen, like you were family. He wanted to know who this woman was who brought light to an old Marine's quiet days. Lastly, there's a fund. It's not a fortune, not by today's standards, but it's enough to cover a year or 2 of college for your grandson, Tyler. You spoke of him so often, your voice softening with love every time his name came up. I remember those stories, Helen, and I wanted to do something to honor the joy you found in him. Please don't see this as charity or think it's more than you deserve. This is my way of saying thank you, of repaying the peace you gave me when I needed it most. No pension, no medal, no grand ceremony ever gave me what you did, a sense of belonging in a world that had moved on without me. With the deepest respect and gratitude, Francis D. Donovan, United States Marine Corps, retired. Helen's hands trembled as she reached the final words, her tears falling in silent, steady streams. The letter slipped from her fingers, drifting to the desk like a leaf caught in a gentle breeze. She didn't move to retrieve it. Instead, she clutched the small flag that had accompanied the letter tightly to her chest, its folds a tangible reminder of the man who had written those words. Her heart ached with a mixture of sorrow and warmth, a bittersweet recognition of the bond they had shared, unspoken but profound. "You belonged here, Frank," she whispered, her voice barely audible, thick with emotion. "You always did." This next morning, long before the first pot of coffee began to brew, Helen sat in the quiet diner, the letter resting on the counter beside her. She traced the edges of the wooden box, her fingers lingering on the worn grain, feeling the weight of a life lived with courage and loss. In that moment, she vowed to honor Francis's memory, not just through the gifts he'd left, but by continuing to serve with the same grace he'd seen in her. The world might have forgotten him, but she never would. The coffee pot hissed and gurgled as it finished brewing, filling the air with a warm, familiar aroma that mingled with the faint scent of bacon sizzling on the grill. Helen McBride stepped into the diner, her arms cradling a folded American flag, a framed, handwritten note, and a quiet resolve that seemed to anchor her every movement. Her steps were deliberate, slower than the usual brisk pace she took when opening the diner, as though each footfall carried the weight of memory. The early morning sun was just beginning to peek over the horizon, its golden rays slicing through the blinds and spilling across the linoleum floor in soft, radiant streaks. It was the same light that used to bathe Frank's broad shoulders as he sat in his usual spot, sipping black coffee with a stillness that felt like a prayer. Helen's heart tightened at the thought, a pang of loss mingling with pride as she made her way to booth 7. At the table, Helen paused, her fingers brushing the edge of the worn formica surface. With a tenderness that bordered on reverence, she placed the flag, neatly folded into a crisp triangle by the Marines, at the center of the table. Its stars gleamed faintly in the dawn light, a silent testament to a life of service. Next to it, she set a modest wooden frame, its glass protecting a note written in her own careful hand. "He sat here every morning. He never asked for anything but kindness." The words felt inadequate to capture Frank's essence, yet they were all she could muster. She stood back, her eyes lingering on the arrangement, her chest swelling with a mix of sorrow and purpose. She didn't speak, didn't announce her intentions to the handful of early regulars nursing their coffee at the counter. There was no need. They watched her in quiet understanding, their gazes soft with recognition. In the days that followed, the story of Booth 7 spread through the small town like ripples across a still pond. At first, it was hushed murmurs, mail carriers exchanging knowing nods with barbers, waitresses whispering to delivery drivers. Then it grew louder, amplified by social media posts, shared by local veterans groups, and cemented by a photo Tyler, the young line cook, had snapped on his phone and printed to hang in the diner's window. Booth 7, people began to say, that's where the Marine sat. The words carried a weight, a reverence that transformed the ordinary table into something sacred. Veterans from across generations started making their way to the diner. Some wore their service proudly, faded ball caps embroidered with unit insignias, jackets adorned with patches. Others bore no outward sign, but Helen could always tell. It was in the way they stood a little taller, their shoulders squared as if still answering a long-ago roll call. It was in the way their eyes lingered on the flag before drifting to the menu, a quiet acknowledgement of shared sacrifice. One morning, an older man in a worn denim vest shuffled in, his face etched with lines that spoke of hard years and harder memories. A Vietnam vet, Helen guessed. My man, her heart softening as she watched him approach booth 7. He stood for a long moment, his hands trembling slightly as he reached into his pocket and pulled out a tattered unit patch. Its threads frayed, but its colors still vivid. Without a word, he folded it neatly and placed it beside the flag, his fingers lingering as if reluctant to let go. He met Helen's eyes, gave a single nod, and walked back out into the morning sun, his silhouette framed briefly in the doorway. The gesture left Helen breathless, her throat tight with unspoken gratitude. Another veteran, a younger man with a buzz cut and a haunted gaze, left a pair of dog tags, their metal links draped carefully around the base of the napkin holder. He didn't stay long, just long enough to leave his mark, his shoulders hunched as he slipped out. Some visitors didn't leave anything at all. They came to sit, to occupy the space where Frank had once been. They didn't order coffee or eggs, didn't chat with the waitstaff. They simply slid into the booth, their palms pressing flat against the table as if drawing strength from its surface. Some bowed their heads, their lips moving in silent words. Others closed their eyes, their faces etched with memories too heavy to speak aloud. Helen watched them from behind the counter, her heart aching with a mix of pride and sorrow. She felt like a guardian, tasked with protecting this sacred ritual, this unspoken communion. Tyler, ever thoughtful, started keeping a small notebook under the counter, its pages open for those who wanted to leave a message. Some entries were brief, raw with emotion. Semper Fi, brother. Thank you for reminding me I'm not alone. Others spilled across pages, stories of service and survival, of comrades lost and battles fought, words that hadn't been spoken in years, if ever. Each entry felt like a gift, a piece of someone's soul entrusted to the diner's care. Helen stopped cleaning booth 7. She couldn't bring herself to touch it, to disturb the growing collection of offerings or the quiet sanctity of the space. Instead, she dusted around it, careful not to shift the flag or the frame. Each morning, she adjusted the blinds to ensure the sun fell across the table, just as Frank had loved it, its warmth a reminder of his presence. The jukebox, once a constant hum of country tunes and oldies, fell silent whenever booth 7 was occupied. No one needed to say it, the music felt intrusive, out of place in a corner that had become hallowed ground. It wasn't about grief, not entirely. It wasn't just about mourning Frank's passing. It was about celebrating how he'd lived, quietly, with dignity, asking for nothing but offering everything. It was about how a single act of kindness, like the coffee he'd shared with a stranger or the nod he'd given a weary regular, could ripple outward, touching lives he'd never know. The diner became a pilgrimage site, though no one called it that. People didn't come to snap selfies or post on social media. They came to remember, to honor, to find a moment of peace in a world that often felt too loud. Booth 7, once just another seat in a small-town diner, had become a monument to something larger. Resilience, sacrifice, the unspoken bonds that tie people together. One Thursday morning, Tyler found an envelope wedged into the diner's mailbox, its surface bare except for the words, "For Mrs. McBride," written in bold block letters. He handed it to Helen with a curious frown, his brow knitting as she carefully opened it. Inside was a single sheet of lined paper, its words scrawled in a steady hand. No greeting, no signature, just a story. He carried me 3 miles through desert heat after an IED took my leg. I told him to leave me. He told me to shut up and hold on. Said it was nothing. It wasn't. It saved my life. Helen's hands trembled as she read, her eyes blurring with tears. She pressed the letter to her chest, her heart swelling with pride and pain. Frank had never spoken of that day, never boasted of his courage. But here it was, a piece of his legacy, left in an unmarked envelope for her to find. She tucked the letter into the frame beside the flag, its words now part of the story of Booth 7. The diner hummed with life around her, but in that moment, Helen felt Frank's presence as clearly as if he were sitting there, his coffee cup steaming, his quiet smile warming the room. Booth 7 wasn't just a table anymore. It was a testament to a man who'd lived with honor and to the countless others who carried his spirit forward, one quiet moment at a time. Helen's hands trembled slightly as she unfolded the letter, its edges worn from being carried in someone's pocket for too long. She read it once, then twice, her eyes lingering on each word as if they might vanish if she looked away. By the third read, her heart felt heavy, full of a quiet ache that had become familiar since Frank Donovan's passing. With care, she slipped the letter into the leather-bound journal he had left behind, its worn cover soft under her fingertips. She kept it tucked beneath the counter at McBride's diner, right next to the guest book her grandson Tyler had started, where visitors scrawled their names and memories. But the letters, they kept coming, like whispers from a life Frank had never spoken of aloud. Some arrived in crisp envelopes stamped with military postmarks, their corners sharp and official. Others were slipped under the diner's door in the hush of dawn, as if their senders couldn't bear to be seen. A few were scrawled in hurried, heartfelt handwriting, ink smudged by unsteady hands. Others were typed, precise and formal, signed only with initials that left Helen wondering about the faces behind them. Yet every letter carried the same thread, a testament to Frank Donovan's unyielding strength, his steady leadership, his selfless heart that asked for nothing in return. One letter, written in a shaky script, stayed with Helen for days. The writer described a night in Mosul, pinned under jagged rubble, his breath shallow and his hope fading as the rest of his unit retreated. Everyone else was gone, he wrote, but Frank stayed. He clawed through the debris with his bare hands, blood dripping from his fingers. He pulled me out, carried me to safety. We never spoke of it again. I see the scar on my arm every day, and it's him I think of. Not the pain, but the man who wouldn't leave me behind. Helen's throat tightened as she read it, imagining Frank's quiet determination, his refusal to abandon someone in need. She could picture his weathered hands, the same ones that had once held a coffee cup at Booth 7, now raw and bleeding for a stranger's life. Another letter came from a woman whose brother had been saved by Frank in Fallujah. My family never got the chance to thank him, she wrote, her words heavy with regret. We didn't even know his name until years later. This letter is my way of trying to make it right. Helen felt the weight of that gratitude, the kind that lingers across years and miles, and she tucked the letter carefully into the journal, as if it were a piece of Frank's soul she was tasked with protecting. What had begun as a simple act of remembrance at Booth 7 was growing into something deeper, something almost holy. A mosaic of stories that painted a man who had lived with quiet, unshakable courage. Tyler, Helen's grandson, had always been curious about the man his grandmother spoke of with such reverence. Frank's name came up often, woven into her stories like a thread that held the diner together. One evening, after the last customer had left and the diner was quiet, Tyler pulled the journal from under the counter. He sat at the counter, the fluorescent lights humming softly overhead, and opened the worn cover. He'd expected military logs, dry, technical notes filled with acronyms he wouldn't understand. Instead, what he found cracked his heart wide open. The pages were raw, unfiltered glimpses into Frank's life. Entries spoke of sandstorms that raged for days, choking the air and stinging his skin. He wrote of young soldiers he'd led into battle, their faces etched in his memory, and the letters he'd written to their families when they didn't come home. I told their mothers they were brave, one entry read, but I didn't tell them how scared they looked at the end. I carry that for them. Tyler's chest tightened as he read, imagining Frank alone in a tent, pen in hand, bearing the weight of those losses so others wouldn't have to. There were notes about cold rations that tasted like dust, radios that crackled and failed, and decisions that haunted him, choices that meant life or death, with no time to second guess. Some pages were nearly illegible. the ink blurred by water or perhaps tears, as if Frank had poured his grief onto the paper. But amidst the pain, there were moments of light. One entry, written in a steadier hand, simply read, Booth 7. She called me Mr. Donovan again today, looked me in the eye like I was still someone worth knowing. Tyler paused, his fingers tracing the words. He could almost see Frank sitting in that corner booth, his posture straight, but his eyes soft, finding a fleeting sense of home in Helen's kindness. Tyler didn't speak as he read, didn't ask questions. He just turned the pages slowly, each one sinking deeper into his soul. The man who had braved fire and rubble, who had carried soldiers to safety and written their final stories, had come home and chosen silence. Not out of weakness, but because the world's noise couldn't hold the weight of what he carried inside. It hit Tyler then, the paradox of Frank Donovan, a hero who didn't need to shout his deeds because his life had spoken them loud enough. Through the letters that kept arriving, through the journal's raw confessions, through the strangers who came to Booth 7 not just to remember but to heal, Frank's story was unfolding. It was told in quiet acts of kindness, in the way he'd lived with integrity, in the way his memory has stitched together the lives of those he'd touched. Helen stood in the doorway of McBride's diner one early morning, before the world had stirred awake. The parking lot stretched empty before her, the horizon glowing with the first hints of sunrise. Its light slipped through the window panes, casting long, golden shadows across the worn linoleum floor. In her hands, she cradled a steaming cup of black coffee, not for herself but for Booth 7, or, as she now thought of it, Frank's table. It had become her ritual, brewing the first pot earlier than needed, pouring a cup, and setting it gently at the corner table where Frank had once sat. To her, it was no longer just a booth. It was a sacred space, a place where a man's dignity had rested without ever demanding recognition. As she gazed at the table, her eyes traced the items that had gathered there over time. A folded flag, its edges crisp and solemn, a framed note from a soldier's widow, a scattering of mementos left by strangers who'd heard of Frank Donovan. Each one told a piece of his story, a life built on quiet sacrifice. Helen's heart swelled with a mix of pride and sorrow, thinking of the years she'd known him. Frank had been a fixture at McBride's, always polite, always a little distant, as if he carried a weight no one else could see. Yet in those moments when their eyes met, when she'd refill his coffee or call him Mr. Donovan, with a smile, she'd glimpse the man beneath, a man who still believed in goodness despite all he'd endured. In the soft hum of the diner, Helen McBride stood just a few steps from a woman whose presence seemed to blend into the faded wallpaper. The woman was kind, always had been, her smile a quiet offering to every soul who crossed the threshold of her small establishment. She poured coffee with a steady hand, her movements practiced yet gentle, as if each cup carried a silent wish for the person receiving it. But on this morning, as the sunlight filtered through the diner's smudged windows, Helen's heart felt heavier than usual. She found herself wondering about the countless faces that had come and gone through her doors. How many carried burdens too heavy to voice, scars too deep to reveal? She thought of Frank Donovan, a man whose quiet presence had left an indelible mark on her soul, and she felt a pang of regret for all the moments she might have missed, all the stories she hadn't paused to hear. Frank had been a regular, his worn boots scuffing the linoleum as he settled into Booth 7 each morning. He never asked for much, just black coffee and a moment of peace. Helen had always greeted him with warmth, unaware of the weight he carried until the day a letter arrived, tucked inside an envelope with a folded American flag. That flag, small but heavy with meaning, was his final gift to her, a symbol of a life lived with courage and sacrifice. It wasn't just a token, it was a revelation. Frank had found solace in those quiet mornings, in the simple act of being seen, of being treated as more than a shadow passing through. That realization settled into Helen's heart like the final piece of a puzzle she hadn't known she was assembling. It stirred something deep within her, a purpose she hadn't known she needed. Determined to honor Frank's memory, Helen made a choice that felt both small and monumental. She sat at her worn kitchen table late one evening, her hands trembling slightly as she typed out a simple message on her old computer. She printed it on plain white paper, the words stark and sincere. With care, she laminated the sheet herself, the plastic curling slightly at the edges, and taped it to the wall beside the register the next morning. The sign read, "Soy, to all veterans, your coffee is on us every morning until 9 o'clock a.m. No need to explain, you've done enough." She didn't shout about it from the rooftops or post it on the internet. She didn't call the local paper or make a fuss. She simply placed it there, a quiet promise to those who might need it, and waited. And they came, one by one, as if drawn by an unspoken call. A Navy veteran, his hands trembling as he adjusted the purple heart pinned to his faded ball cap, stepped through the door. His eyes caught the sign, and a flicker of gratitude passed across his weathered face as he accepted his coffee. A retired Air Force mechanic, gruff and reserved, became a regular, offering only a curt nod to the sign before settling into a corner booth with his steaming mug. A young woman in fatigues, her eyes carrying a weariness far beyond her years, sat alone in the back, clutching her coffee as if it were an anchor, keeping her tethered to the present. Some veterans murmured soft thank yous, their voices thick with emotion. Others offered only a fleeting smile, their gratitude unspoken but palpable. But every single one of them noticed the flag at Booth 7, its stars and stripes a silent sentinel. Whether they knew Frank's story or not, they seemed to feel its weight, its quiet reverence. Booth 7 remained untouched, a sacred space in the bustling diner. No orders were taken there, no trays cleared. Once Tyler, the young busboy with a heart as big as his dreams, offered to polish the table, his rag already in hand. Helen stopped him with a gentle shake of her head, her voice soft but firm. "It's perfect the way it is," she said, her eyes lingering on the booth. And so it remained, a quiet monument to a man who had asked for nothing but had given everything. Over time, others began to leave their own tributes. A unit pin tucked beside the salt shaker, a handwritten note folded carefully beneath a napkin, even a service medal placed reverently under the sugar jar. It became a living memorial, not frozen in stone, but alive in the small, heartfelt gestures of those who understood. For Helen, life went on. The eggs still crackled on the grill, the coffee brewed in endless pots, and the register chimed with every transaction. But something within her had changed irrevocably. She carried a quiet pride, a humbling awareness that her simple acts of kindness, offering a smile, a warm cup of coffee, had altered the course of someone's story. Frank's memory was a beacon, guiding her to extend that kindness to every veteran who walked through her door, each one seeking a moment of peace, a chance to feel human again. Booth 7 stood empty, yet it overflowed with meaning, a testament to the power of seeing someone for who they truly are. In a world that seemed to race faster every day, Helen had learned to notice the quiet ones, the men and women who carried their stories in silence, in the creases of worn journals or the soles of battered boots. Frank Donovan hadn't needed fanfare or accolades. He had needed only dignity, a small gesture of respect that had rippled through his life and now through hers. That lesson burned brightly in her heart. In a time when division shouted louder than unity, kindness was a choice, a gift that cost nothing but could change everything. Whether it was a veteran sipping coffee in her diner, a neighbor passing by with a nod, or a stranger sitting quietly in the park, Helen knew now that a single moment of connection, "I'm glad you're here," could echo through a lifetime. Booth 7 was just a corner of a small-town diner, but it had become a sacred space, a place that transformed the way she saw the world. And perhaps, she thought, everyone had their own Booth 7, a person, a moment, a quiet act of kindness that changed them forever. For Helen, it was a reminder to pause, to look, to listen, because you never knew who was sitting quietly, waiting to be remembered.